number of people I've spoken to in over a year. Over a year ago, just over a year ago, I was complaining about making too many presentations. And now this is the first one I've made in a year. So I don't feel quite as articulate as I might want to, but I hope you'll bear with me. We will be speaking, of course, about 1867 and years around it, but 1867 particularly recognizing it as an unprecedented year of disasters in the Danish West Indies. How did we engage this study? First of all, I don't know if Shirley is looking at this, but I really appreciated, Sophia, you and the CGL leadership recognizing Shirley Lincoln. She was just so priceless in pulling this together. She was a full partner, and how we came about being interested in the materials is I had studied physical oceanography and was very familiar with tsunamis, but like many Virgin Islanders, did not know that we had been visited by one, 150 years prior, until I happened upon a book by James Lander. Some of you have seen that and used it as a source. And that led up to my participating in an IOC group that was studying tsunamis called the Consultation of Experts. They needed a place to meet. Hurricane Marilyn had just devastated UVI's field station in St. John. A few cabins were safe and available. And so I invited the Consultation of Experts to come, and it was actually the first such meeting in at least the English-speaking Caribbean. Shirley Lincoln helped me to prepare for all of this. And when we were done, we had pulled out so many materials just to share with our participants that we thought it really foolish to just put them away or to just allow them to wait to be published, in refereed scientific journals, which would probably not be read by the populace, not by decision makers in the Virgin Islands. And so we thought it needed to be published as a compilation. And we further thought that we would publish all of the documents that we had harvested pretty much in uncut form. So we didn't make typographical and other changes, something for which we were criticized a bit later on. But I think you see where we were coming from. We wanted our presentation to be as if you went straight to the microfiche yourself and had found it in many cases. And Shirley, I must say, had uncovered so many materials that time and money caused us to stop 137 pages because there was so much more that could have been added. Further motivation. Among the papers from, this is the St. Thomas Teton Day, flipping through the files that Shirley and I were editing, I come upon this. Drowned on Monday, the 18th instant in the harbor of St. Thomas, Mr. Samuel Watlington, son of Captain J.H. Watlington of St. Croix, etc., etc. The death of the deceased was caused by trying to rescue his father from, while being on board the ship British Empire. I was already aware of the fact that the British Empire had gone down in the hurricane of 1867, and I was also aware that the Watlingtons of St. Croix were wreckers, another word for salvagers. In fact, the Watlingtons of Key West, Florida, are also wreckers, and I believe also of North Carolina. The ones in Key West, actually, I think one of the oldest standing buildings in Key West is called the Wrecker Museum or Watlington House. And it's the same family line that came to St. Croix. So I was really very motivated that I had a cousin, whether by bondage or by birth, he was my cousin in some way, who had perished in this event that I was interested in. Well, October 1867, everything seemed pretty quiet in the Danish West Indies, at least for a while. Externally, many things were unfolding. The US was just recovering from its civil war and from the impacts, let me minimize my pictures in a way, okay, and from the impacts of the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln. Good. Post-Civil War Reconstruction was faltering, and the nation was occupied with the struggle between the US Congress and President Andrew Johnson. As many of you know, they would go on to impeach him. Alaska had just been purchased in March. Some thought it would be an unwise purchase. It was called Seward's Folly after William H. Seward, the US Secretary of State. He was also the architect of the US acquisition of St. Thomas and St. John. In the Caribbean and in the US Gulf states, yellow fever and other infectious diseases were ravishing some communities and disrupting both economics and trade. And the treaty for the transfer was signed on October 24th, 1867, but ratification by the Danish Parliament was still necessary. Ratification by the US Senate was necessary. A favorable plebiscite of the voting residents of St. Thomas and St. John was necessary, and more. Among the more would be a disposition of the US House of Representatives to fund this venture, and they were already aching under the purchase of Alaska. So there were a lot of factors that had to be considered. Related events, well, the Danish and the American envoys representing on the Danish part, King Christian IX, and on the American part, Secretary of State Seward, they were gathering in St. Croix to further discuss the details and the voting that they were preparing to do, the plebiscite. In Cuba, Hispaniola, and Puerto Rico, however, resistance to Spanish rule was beginning to take form. A number of particular persons were actually active in all three liberation movements, as well as activity in Haiti. So there was ferment of a political kind, aside from what was happening in the United States. Most notable in this ferment was Ramon Emeterio Betanzos, and his Puerto Rican militants, who would from time to time meet in St. Thomas in the Danish West Indies, plotting the Puerto Rican independence. And in fact, they prepared a ship called El Telegrafo for supplying munitions for the likely revolt against Spain. And off and on, and CGL, the Caribbean Geological Library, has dealt with this gentleman quite a bit. The exiled Mexican president, General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, he had just left his last exile in St. Thomas. He had moved to the Bahamas, and he had begun disposing of his properties on St. Thomas. That didn't finish until 1868. This action of his signaled the loss of interest in him by the United States, political interest, because they were worried if he was going to become a factor in the Mexican situation, where Benito Juarez was being supported by the United States, and of course France and Emperor Maximilian were still in the wings. And then with regard to the infectious diseases, well, quite a few infectious diseases are possible, and many of these, of course, have ravaged the region in different periods, some simultaneously. But in this period, the one we're looking at most seriously is yellow fever. Earlier in 1850, cholera had been the primary one. Typhus was always lurking around whenever conditions allowed lice and fleas and mites to invade. Smallpox, was a problem as well. Tuberculosis and malaria. But yellow fever is the one we want to keep an eye on. That's the one that'll have most impact in the period that we're talking about. So with regard to yellow fever, a few quotes are interesting. Dr. T. Bacon Phillip, he was a surgeon, or the doctor on board of the La Plata. He says, "I have never left this wharf, and I've done so some 20 times, without finding some sporadic cases of fever a few days after getting to sea. In the whole of the West Indies, it would be impossible to find a situation where the localizing conditions of miasma were so apparent as at this spot." That was 1853. 1860, it's still a problem. This is the New York Times. "The news from this little island, St. Thomas, is generally confined to deaths from yellow fever, sometimes more, sometimes less, but always sufficiently numerous to terrify the unacclaimed," and so forth. Well, I should say, he said, "No northern vessel even now can enter port and discharge her cargo without losing one or more of her crew." He goes on, "The mortality on board these ships," meaning the ships of the Royal Mail Steam Packet Company, "has been so great of late that a removal of the depot from St. Thomas to one of the English islands has been strongly urged by the company. When that happens, this port will lose much of its present business importance." And we sort of know how that story plays out. But this last sentence also has some impacts for the first of the natural disasters that I'm about to describe. Further on yellow fever, so many deaths were occurring from the fever that stay in St. Thomas was reduced to a minimum late in 1866. This is from the St. Thomas Historical Society's record. The fever again reached epidemic proportions, the first outbreak in 8 years. The Royal Mail Steam Packet Company, they temporarily moved its transfer operations for passengers, coal, and cargo to Peter Island in the British Virgin Islands. You will remember that the ships of the Royal Mail Steam Packet made the major haul across the Atlantic. And then when it reached St. Thomas, some transshipping would take place where smaller vessels not quite able to cross the Atlantic would redistribute to the surrounding islands. Well, that depot now is being temporarily shifted to Peter Island in the British Virgin Islands. Now, what about the treaty? The treaty for the transfer had been signed in October, as I said. Okay, discussions to finalize the deal were taking place in St. Croix. Dixon in the Boston Advertiser quotes the Danish consul Frisch in a statement of 1867. He says, "We shall require that the consent of the people of the islands be had." Here they're looking out for the voting residents of the Danish West Indies, to whom they still felt great affection, and they wanted to make sure they had some say in the deal. Dixon also further quotes U.S. Secretary of State William H. Seward, however, who says, "It is not believed that the consent of the people of the islands is necessary." However, fortunately, Seward relented, and he, on October 5th, telegraphed instructions to George Yeaman, his envoy in St. Croix, waiving that objection and saying that he consents that a popular vote would be taken in the islands at the instance of Denmark. But then, what happens next? October 29th, without warning, coming in from the east and rampaging through the British Virgin Islands, then St. John, then St. Thomas, Culebra, and going on to Puerto Rico, a small but powerful earthquake. By the time it left Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, it had caused between 500 and 600 fatalities. It was called the San Narciso hurricane because of the Feast of San Narciso that was occurring in the Spanish-speaking countries at that time. And this map from Unisys shows, this chart shows the path, almost due west. Starting from right to left, it was coming in north of us, I believe something like what Hurricane Irma did in 2017. And then it jogged to the south just enough to make a westward trip right through the British Virgin Islands, St. John, St. Thomas, and going on to Puerto Rico. The Rhone was at the anchor in Peter Island, participating in the transfer of passengers. And it went to the bottom with its 150 lives. Today, it's a famous dive wreck. You see T-shirts saying, "I dove the Rhone." But this tragedy was one of the results of the port of transfer being changed from St. Thomas to the BVI. It was said, I haven't seen recently, I've had to revisit a lot of the source materials to make sure I wasn't imagining some things, because that's what happens when you tell a story over and over again. You want to make sure that you're still on target. And the story was that there were very few crewmen lost when the road went down because they were up and about attending to the care of the ship. But passengers, the 150 lives were mostly passengers. They had tied themselves into their beds, and therefore they were not ambulatory. They couldn't run around. I'm not sure if that's still a statement that I can find information on to verify. But so it was ruined. So this is a Danish cut of what the harbor of St. Thomas might have looked like. A better version, of course, is the one that was published in Harper's Weekly, and it shows a rubble made up of the ships that were damaged by the hurricane. In the middle of this rubble is supposed to be the British Empire, which was a large, essentially comfortable passenger vessel, and it went to the bottom. Okay, but in the meantime, right, no sooner than the hurricane had passed, it's back to business. I show this chart because if you notice the arrivals into St. Thomas, it's very interesting that there are only 2 Danish arrivals, 8 Americans. We can presume many of those being associated with the discussions for the transfer. Many English, most of those carrying merchandise, as were the Danish, French, and other ships coming in. This was in a Marine Register published in the Tiden Day. Well, among the activities was the moving back and forth between St. Thomas and St. Croix of the USS Monongahela. It was moving the diplomats back and forth. And at the time that the next chapter of this story opens, it was anchored in Frederiksted Harbor. The Danish and the US diplomats had resumed, after the hurricane, had resumed meeting to strategize the execution of the transfer, including encouraging a favorable vote from the residents. The Danish envoy in charge was Commissioner Chamberlain Carstensen, and the top US envoy was Dr. Charles Harley, and they were meeting in Christiansted. And they were accommodated by ranking naval officers such as Rear Admiral J.S. Palmer and the captain of the Monongahela, Dr. Commodore Bissell. I should point out that Admiral Palmer, with his ship, the Susquehanna, had been a very successful and famous Civil War hero. He was, at the time of this activity in St. Croix, still the top admiral for the North Atlantic Squadron, and was greatly respected by the Navy and by Washington. Looking at arrivals again, I want to point out then some of these specific ships. This is entering in the days after the hurricane, but before the next series of cataclysmic events. There's the Monongahela, presumably moving back and forth between St. Croix and St. Thomas. It had come in from St. Croix. Commodore Bissell is in charge. There's the Susquehanna under Rear Admiral Palmer, and it is mostly at anchor in St. Thomas, going to move to St. Croix later on. The DeSoto, another U.S. war vessel, is there again, as was the, and then in addition to military vessels, the English steamer La Plata cleared on the 17th, came in on the 17th, Captain Revitt in charge, and on board they had passengers, but this vessel was also bringing the proclamation from King Christian IX, informing the people of the Danish West Indies of the intention to make the secession, and also asking their support. And here's parts of that letter. Aboard the La Plata, the letter from the Danish king starts off with, "We, Christian IX," I guess that's editorial, "we, Christian IX." He said, he told him that he was gonna, his intention to sell St. Thomas and St. John, but that he would keep St. Croix. And he allowed, he says, "As we, however, will not exercise any constraints over our faithful subjects, we'll give you the opportunity of freely and extensively expressing your wishes in regard to this session." And this would be, of course, achieved by a plebiscite. The king concluded with his best wishes, "Befallende ere gut," meaning commending you to God. The sincerity of the Danes seemed really genuine. They were not eager to give up the islands. There were many economic reasons and practical reasons, and maybe even politically strategic and military reasons why they might think it wise to do so at this time, but they still felt great affection to the islands. Some will ask why St. Croix was not being transferred at this time. With the participants in this lecture that we have now, more than 93 people, I noticed some of the names. Many of you listening to me right now have much more expertise in this than I do, but in general, it had to do with the St. Croix having been purchased from the French, and French consent would have been a factor. And you can correct me or extend on that during maybe the question answer period. Now here's the accounts. In the records from the Emmaus Moravian Church in Coral Bay, St. John, Brother Warner writes on November 26th, this is after the hurricane, he said, "I expected to see the church well filled on Sunday after the storm, but found it unusually empty." Now here's the harbinger of things to come. "Nevertheless, what one visitation failed to effect has been done by another of November 18th in a wonderful manner." You know the meaning of wonderful in 1867. "At 10 minutes before 3 p.m., we were all startled and driven out of our house by a fearful shock of an earthquake." I jump ahead in his report. He says, "Monday night we spent in our yard with no other shelter than afforded by the vault of heaven. Above all was clear and beautiful but beneath all was a ferment. There were continued rumblings and constant shocks. The initial earthquake or multiple earthquakes were followed for days and months afterwards by shocks, and people were, as I'll explain later, very much afraid of sleeping inside of wall buildings. Schematically, this is what happened. November 18th, around 2:50 p.m., there was a sudden energetic motion, a rupture actually, along a fault at great depth in the Virgin Islands Basin. This is kind of what the Virgin Islands Basin looks like in an old sketch. You see St. Thomas, St. John to the top. You see Vieques to the left, which is to the west, and you see St. Croix below. These contours have since been improved, but they're not, even for an old drawing, they're not really all that off. The exact location, the epicenter or the hypocenter of the earthquake is still being refined by scientists, but we think it's a little bit more to the west than initially thought. And we don't believe that it actually happened at the very bottom of the Virgin Islands Basin. The water between St. Thomas, St. Croix, and Vieques is the Virgin Islands Basin. It's the true way from the Anegada Passage, which comes from the northeast. It's geologically very, very active, and it is 2.8 miles deep. So there it is. I thought some of you might be napping, and I wanted to give you a little alert. So if you look into the Virgin Islands from Puerto Rico, say like from El Yunque, and you're in eastern Puerto Rico, and you're looking to the east, you see St. Thomas and St. John to your left. Beyond them would be the Anegada Passage and the British Virgin Islands. The deep chasm in front of you would be the Virgin Islands Basin. And to the right, which is the south, you would see St. Croix. Someplace in that area, we believe a little bit along the northern flank of the Virgin Islands Basin, is where the earthquake occurred. It is estimated now to have been a magnitude of about 7.3 to 7.5 on the Richter scale. They were not rating earthquakes in 1867 on the Richter scale, but this is how it was estimated after the fact. The earthquake, just speaking about the earthquake itself and not what it would cause in addition as a secondary calamity, the primary quakes, which were followed by many aftershocks, continued into 1867. It took many lives. It caused landslides and slope failure. It destroyed buildings and roads. It instilled fear of living in wall houses. I'll get back to that. There are lithographs and other sketches of some of the damage. To the left, you see a church steeple that was toppled in Frederiksted. And another result of the initial set of quakes was it generated what would follow next, the 1867 Danish West Indies tsunami. The tsunami followed in 6 to 10 minutes. The first waves of the tsunami followed in 6 to 10 minutes. As some of you know, a tsunami is usually many waves. 4 distinct strong waves were noted in a short time after the earthquake, and they immediately moved out. 6 minutes to Frederiksted, 10 minutes to Charlotte Amalia, a little bit more to Coral Bay, and about 10 minutes to Christiansted. The reason why I got to Frederiksted first was maybe Frederiksted was a little bit nearer, but tsunamis travel faster in deep water, and the water between the site of the earthquake and Frederiksted is very, very deep. The result of that is that it got to Frederiksted first. With regard to St. Thomas now, the sketch, the lithograph on the right in Harper's shows the Royal Mail, which had brought that letter from the king and was coaling just outside of the harbor. We believe to the west of Hassel Island. You see Water Island there. There's some confusion in the diagram there. I think that it has been said to be Water Island. It might actually be Hassel Island. And some of you have seen a larger frame of this picture, which shows Little Sabre to the west, which is to the right. And I'll speak about that as well. Well, this is how downtown Frederiksted may have looked in the tsunami. The wave probably came into Frederiksted around 20 feet, and it swept right through the town. People fled before it, running to hills. For its part, the wave didn't climb hills, and it didn't topple major stone buildings, and that had some impact on the loss of life, which I'll speak about also in a minute. Brother Warner continues his report. He says, the unusual ferment of the sea struck terror into many hearts and brought some desperately wicked men upon their knees, crying for mercy. we can imagine. All right. Now, what is happening in other places? Well, St. Thomas Harbor, the DeSoto is in harbor, and Commodore Boggs reports after the earthquake, he rushed to the deck. He said, "On reaching the deck, I found the water rushing out of the harbor with great violence. In a few minutes, a great wave was seen approaching from the southeast between the islands of St. Thomas and St. Croix." Although his account doesn't make it clear, apparently the water went out first, not only in St. Thomas Harbor, but also in Christiansted and Frederiksted. Sometimes when a tsunami occurs, it would occur with the water going out first, but not all of the time. As much as 50% of the time, it might just simply be the water coming in first, depending on how the tsunami wave was generated. Now, here speaks Rear Admiral Palmer. He says, the DeSoto, the same vessel that he's looking at, which was anchored outside of us, was lying rather broadside to, and was carrying from our moorings both chains snapping and thrown apart the iron piles of a new wharf, lately constructed. The next rollers swept her off into deep water, and soon she made signal that she was leaking. The DeSoto would not sink and would be able to sail again. On St. Croix, Frederiksted, you remember the Monongahela was sitting off of Frederiksted under the command of Commodore Bissell, and it had brought and discharged water for it to float, and another wave then brought it back in, but this time deposited it on the strand, which is where this lithograph shows it. This was not far away, where in 1999, Hurricane Lenny actually put a major buoy was put right on Strand Street in Frederiksted. We imagine very close to where the Monongahela had rested. The Monongahela was left high and dry and needed repairs before it could be refloated. That work took until the next year. I think they finally refloated it in May. Its crew worked with Frederiksted residents, helping them to recover, interacting a great deal with them, and apparently with considerable affection developing between the crew of the Monongahela and the residents. The vessel was eventually refloated the next year. But there were casualties, and I'll have to be very clear about the casualties. This shows a gravestone in the Frederiksted Lutheran Church with a grave holding sailors from the Monongahela who perished directly or indirectly as a result of the tsunami. Only a few, maybe as few as 6 of the crewmen actually perished in the earthquake and tsunami. Many would perish in the days, weeks, and months ahead, as you would imagine, from yellow fever. Other seamen who perished as a result of the tsunami are also memorialized in St. Patrick's Catholic Church in Frederiksted. If you count up the names in both tombstones, it comes up to about 20-something, and that's far more than were killed on the day of the actual tsunami. Okay, the earthquake generated tsunami wave traveled far. It went north, west, east. It traveled as far south as Grenada. In Guadeloupe, on its way south, it actually had a higher amplitude coming in to some ports in Guadeloupe than it had in the Danish West Indies. And it actually did take almost as many lives. So the wave dynamics by which that tsunami waves follow are very, very interesting. When I show you a computer model in a minute, you'll see that at some places they didn't seem to be touched, whereas distant places like Grenada were affected. Here's a simulation, the result of a computer simulation done by Zahipo and Pilovinsky, and shows with red being high amplitude and white being sea level. You see the extent of the amplitude of the wave. Strongest in our region, just to the east of Puerto Rico. I guess I can use my cursor. Yes, there you are. That's where it was stronger. And notice it goes all the way down to Grenada and to South America. But note, and you see where the computer model verifies what eyewitnesses observed, that Guadeloupe was impacted significantly, but not Martinique and not Dominica. And that has a lot to do with the fact that the ocean floor is not uniformly level. It has valleys and pits and undersea mountains and many, many changes. And with a tsunami wave moving, depending on the depths of the water, you could see where some places might get a strong wave and others might not. Here's a sketch done by Zahibo as well, and it shows time of travel. Each of these lines show how long it would have taken to get to different places. And you'll see Guadeloupe got it in about 70 minutes, right? And Grenada got it like 100 minutes. Puerto Rico, of course, got it within a half an hour. Okay, now this is a numerical simulation. I hope it works. It is the result of a computer model prepared for Vitima by NOAA, Pacific Marine and Environmental Labs. Diego Arcus and Christopher Moore are the authors. And I hope it work, but let's see. I think it will. First, I'll do a quick run through. Remember, as you look at this, dark means below sea level, and red would mean above sea level. Below sea level means the water is going out. Above sea level means the water is coming in. So with that in mind, I'll do a quick run through now. There you see. This is the computer simulation. And it goes on and on. You say, well, how come waves are coming from the left and from the other directions instead of just from the source area? And the answer is reflections. After the wave hits a coast, it bounces off and will go with still with considerable energy and hit another coast. So now let me stop it and go back and step through it slowly. So in the upper left-hand corner, you see the site area. Oops, go back. In the upper left-hand corner, you see the site area. You see Puerto Rico in the little box, and someplace to the northwest of Puerto Rico is where the tsunami started. At least that's the initializing parameters that these modelers use. There are other possibilities, but most of them pretty much come up with the same conclusions. It's showing dark blue up there because apparently the water was pulled back. How can a wave start off with the water going back? That is, if the bottom of the ocean falls, or if you have a submarine landslide, that would essentially create space, essentially, in the water column to pull water back from the surroundings. So it goes out as a recession. So now I proceed with the stepping. And notice, first there's nothing happening. And if you're still with me, notice it's approaching St. Croix, northern St. Croix. And what's approaching is dark blue, which means the water going out. And then here it comes. And now look at Frederiksted to your lower left hand. It has already impacted Frederiksted. Look at Christiansted. It hasn't hit yet. Christiansted right up against the coast has not had the impact at the same time as Frederiksted. And as I go through, you see then the red comes in. A trough is followed by a wave peak crest. And so you have water going out, water coming in, water going out, water coming in. And at 4 very distinct cycles of that occurred. And I think that's all I'll show you about that. So now, between St. Thomas and St. Croix, there had been discussion taking place in the Titende and in the Avis between editorial characters using vernacular. And one was called Buddy, one was called Tomas, and the other was called Christiana. There was another one called Johnny, representing, of course, Christiansted, and there was Frederica, representing Frederiksted. So here's what Christiansted is saying to St. Thomas. You see, I has come quite sanctified since the earthquake frightened me so. We poor see Frederica been most drowned, but me the Sino been treated so bad. Christiansted not treated so bad. Them say the sea most drown you too, and that you've been frightened to death. Them say that now you has come quite sanctified, and that you don't open your shop and store no more on Sunday. It take earthquake for to convert you. I'm glad for you. All right. So then impacts. Damage, of course, in all the islands ringing the Virgin Islands Basin. That would include the Puerto Rican Virgin Islands, Vieques and Culebra, and the British Virgin Islands, as well as Guadeloupe, as I mentioned, and as far away as Grenada. There was damage to many vessels, including several important U.S. vessels, and to the Marine Railway on Hassel Island. That was very significant. Okay. It damaged, as I said, the damaged vessels, the warehouses, shops, shoreline homes. It destroyed goods and scattered them, and it scattered stocks of coal, not only reducing the value of that resource, but also creating a sort of an environmental problem. It disrupted commerce for months, further affecting the diminishing value of Charlotte Monadia and its harbor. The loss of life was moderate. A lot of people have a hard time with this. With such a tremendous disaster, and people can't believe that as few as 24 may have lost their lives. 24 to 30. I don't find much verification for even much more than 24. NOAA has officially accepted 24 as a number that they use. So 24 to 30 people, the loss of life was moderate when compared to the over 500 people that had lost their lives on October 29th in a hurricane, or later on, when a tsunami impacted Mayagüez in 1918, I believe 116 people lost their lives there. And 1946, when the Dominican Republic experienced a tsunami, earthquake and tsunami, and that took many more lives. And it contaminated the land. After natural hazards, there's always what they call hazmat, the contamination by sewage, coal, oil, fuels, dead animals, and this, of course, causes unhygienic conditions. Infectious disease then would take more lives in the months thereafter. Further incomes. Well, commerce disrupted. Maritime commerce never quite recovered. And then this interesting issue. The fires in the Virgin Islands, most memorable of the 1832 fires in St. Thomas, had been so disastrous to in-town areas that insurance companies took note, and the government took note, and made it very difficult for people to build wood houses in town. In fact, a wall house was preferred. You got better insurance rates, and if you wanted to build, I'm not sure if it was only Charlotte Monadia community, it may have been Christian Set and Frederick Set as well. If you wanted to build a wood house any place near a populated in-town area, you had to build a wall around it so that your fire can be contained. All of this may have contributed to the 50-year delay in the US purchase of the Danish West Indies. The plebiscite was held. Okay, Carstensen, the Danish envoy, he called a meeting of the businessmen of St. John on the 4th of January. He mentioned that Secretary of State Seward would allow the residents to vote. And when that pledge was read to them, their attitudes improved considerably towards the idea of the transfer. The election was then held on January 9th, and 205 voted for session in St. John, and 1,039 in St. Thomas, with only 22 against. So then, now Christiana continues. But the worst thing of all, me dear buddy, is the king letter, what he write for say, that he sell you to the Yankees, and he no sell our we too. 'Tis how we're going to make out. Well, this is referring to the fact that St. Croix was not included in the transfer. But not to give the wrong impression, when our good friend and colleague George Tyson, assented and did a review of disaster and disruption for Shirley Lincoln and myself, he noted that we pretty much stopped right there and didn't go on and didn't make strong statements about what happened afterward. The reason we didn't is because we were presenting the facts as we, with the expertise that we had, knew what we knew, and we actually left it open for historians and others to conclude the story. But as we now know, the transfer was not ratified, not in the vote of 1860, not in 1868 when they thought it would go to the Senate, not in 1869 when they tried to bring it back again. There was Denmark agreed to an extension. The last extension was in 1870, and when that expired, it still had not been approved. So although it was approved by the residents and ratified by the Danish Riksdag, the Danish legislature, and the Riksdag allowed further extensions of the deadlines, US ratification still needed, primarily adoption by the Senate, which would work best if you had strongly motivated support of the new US president. Over this period of time, we go from President Andrew Johnson, who was unpopular and was impeached, to President Grant. And Johnson, as many will say, many in this audience will be able to explain, Johnson had a lot of trouble. He was impeached, and he was not a good advocate for this sale. Seward, of course, had purchased Alaska, and that still was bothering some people. Now you're going to ask the U.S. House of Representatives, which doesn't vote on the treaty, but has to indicate that it's willing to fund the purchase to the extent of $7.5 million. And they're still thinking about the negative attitude of the Alaska purchase, Seward's folly. There were a lot of other things happening domestically and internationally. There was concern about whether the purchase at that time might actually act as as an irritant to some of our competitors internationally. And we had domestic priorities. The country as a whole was becoming more isolationistic as they were trying to solve their internal problems with Reconstruction. But then you also would have to dispel the image that this transfer would essentially be the acquisition of hurricanes, earthquakes, and tsunamis. What about the revolution? Well, the devastation caused by the hurricane in Puerto Rico, left many dead, maybe as many as 200, and it further intensified the hardship under which the people of Puerto Rico were living. It further demonstrated Spain's incapacity and or its disinterest in attending to their needs to the extent that they felt they needed. So independence from Spain or some sort of separation from Spain was desired. The plotters had stored significant supplies of munitions for the revolution in St. Thomas aboard the vessel El Telegrafo, as I said before. However, the Danish West Indies government intervened, capturing the ship and turning the supplies over to the Spaniards. The revolt did eventually take place in September of the next year. It was focused around the town of Lares, but it failed, partly because of the inadequate munitions and for many other reasons as well. But today, it's looking back, Puerto Ricans see it as one of the strongest expressions of their wish for independence. It is sometimes referenced in Puerto Rico's dealings today with the United States, and it was patriotically remembered as El Grito de Lares, the cry of Lares. Other ancillary impacts. So in his report to the Department of Navy, Admiral Palmer had written a long letter, and I show you the last lines of it. He spoke about what happened to the DeSoto. He spoke about his going to rescue the Monadia and other things, and he spoke about the fate of his ship. He ends by saying, the damage sustained by this ship is not material. The Susquehanna just came through it, with no problems at all. Well, the damage to the ship was not material, but sadly, Rear Admiral John S. Palmer succumbed to yellow fever, within the same year, in December of 1867. Now, many of you may be ready to raise the question about what about a volcano? There had been talk that you had earthquake, you had hurricane in October, and on the day of of November when the earthquake occurred, you also had tsunami and volcano. There was talk about smells of brimstone and smells of sulfur. I'll read some of the messages. It was generally believed, and I fail to credit this quote, that the harbor of St. Thomas is probably the finest natural harbor, but the point I'm making, formed by an extant volcano crater. Okay. The Tidende says on November 30th, the island of Little Sabre presents a crater full of lava. On the 18th, when the earthquake occurred, we were told by persons deserving of credence that volumes of smoke and flame had been seen to ascend from that very island. Further, if you're lower right-hand corner, George Lattimore quotes, it is historical that Little Sabre was an active volcano, and on the 18th of 19th of November last, emitted smoke, thus showing the volcanic action was not distant. Well, the one I really bring to your attention is Palmer. Palmer said, the Laplace's passengers speak of having felt shocks and looking behind them, saw a small islet that would be Sabre, little Sabre, in their rear, cleft in twain, flame and smoke issuing from the fissure. What about the volcano? Well, in the upper right-hand corner, you see Sabre, a photograph taken from the University of the Virgin Islands campus. In the lower left-hand corner, you see a wider version of that lithograph in which that island to the far right is Little Sabre. In some versions of this lithograph, I've seen smoke drawn in coming from the peak. All right, I'm not sure if these were different editions that Harper has published, or maybe just that the smoke disappears as you make a copy and a poor copy doesn't show it. That may be. But here's sort of how we look at it. So in 1984, that photograph in the middle shows a class from UVI visiting Little Sabre. A few of you in this audience now listening have been to Little Sabre with classes of UVI or with a club we had called the Explorers Club. And you've seen this interior with many pretty colored rocks, and they're called the rocks of the Water Island Formation. They're hydrothermally altered. They're not very sturdy. It's highly friable. When you walk on them, they crush, and you can easily start a landslide. And so that's available during a landslide, to become smoke and dust issuing forth. There's another thing to note. On the back side of Sabre, there's a blowhole, a tunnel that goes to the interior. And one can imagine this is the direction from which the wave came. That when the wave hit the back of Sabre, much of that water would be channeled into that blowhole and come up in the center of the island. A few of you have actually, I think, waded in that pool. And that could go airborne and be seen. Well, it's gone back and forth, and we really trace the original report to Palmer. I find nothing earlier than Palmer where he said that he saw, that he quoted the people on the La Plata of seeing the island, cut in two and issuing smoke and flame. So after many years, and the study still goes on, Reed and Sabre publishes that we found with evolved understanding of the processes that form the islands, there's general acceptance of the hypothesis of Reed and Tabor that landslides on Little Sabre, 6 or 7 kilometers southwest of the harbor, gave rise to the rumor of volcanic action. For those who are interested, we don't believe there was any open air volcanism in the Virgin Islands for millions of years. The last active open air volcanism might have been well more than 1 million years ago. Although the islands are geologically, St. Thomas and St. John at least, volcanic islands, ancient volcanic islands. So now let's look to the present, because I'm concluding. As we look to the present, we look at local sites and recent sites of earthquakes, and you see the little red stars. There in the middle center, there is, well, actually not quite the middle. That black star is what occurred in 1867. Over to the right, in the Mona Passage between Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic, that's what happened in 1918, in 1946, and there was one in 1943 as well. All of these are active areas, either faults or areas where the motion of the tectonic plates that make up the Virgin Islands can actually trigger an earthquake. And how would that affect us? Well, in the US Virgin Islands today, so many things are different. When I wrote that paper anticipating the reoccurrence of an 1867 class earthquake and tsunami, there are a couple of things to note. First of all, how shoreline industry, public use of the spaces on the coast, and public habitation on the coast are now very, very different. Upper right-hand corner, although it's closed right now, you had a school that would have as many as 900 students. That's Adelita Conquine. The lower right-hand corner, you have Lucinda Millen, home for the elderly. The left, upper left, you have passengers getting off of ferries in St. John. In the center, you have a cruise ship or two coming to Frederiksted occasionally. And in the lower left-hand corner, you have the port of St. John, where I have sketched in the possibility of looking up and seeing waves coming in. This is how it might look if you were up at Skyline Drive and you looked at our harbor. It would in fact be frightening. This is the USVI tourism photo that I have modified. It is not accurate. Okay. So let's compare the two periods. Well, comparing 1867 to today, of course, it was Danish, then it's American now. The population was probably around 36,000 then. Now, we're not quite sure. It's less than 106,000. Farming and maritime trades were the industry then. Today, it's tourism, big time, government, education, marine recreation, transportation. Key question, where are the people at 3 p.m. in the afternoon? In 1867, most of the people were not on the coast. They were on the plantations inland. There were government and town businesses on the hills, which were not inundated by the tsunami. And of course, there were some businesses right down to the sea, and they did suffer. Okay. Today, tourism and other industries are marine related, and they are right on the coast. They're at sea. And near the shoreline, you have government offices, you have prison, you have the judicial branch. You have so much happening in the malls that are in town, just taking St. Thomas alone, with Christiansted and Frederiksted being very, very similar. So how much was the warning time? The minimum warning time in 1867 is the same minimum warning time we would have today, because that earthquake and that tsunami are called local. Local earthquakes and tsunami do not allow for any significant warning time. In other words, VITEMA, the U.S. Geological Survey, the Puerto Rico Seismic Network, they would not be able to respond, at least not to the first wave. They will still respond, and you should still listen, because the first wave is not the end. And the messages that they give you will tell you what to do as the disaster continues. But for the first wave, you're on your own. And so the question is, where are people at night? And fortunately, in 1867, most of the people are sleeping, and much of that is upland. Okay, today, of course, with few exceptions, today, most of the people are still sleeping above the 25-meter contour, meaning as far as VITEMA's evacuation maps go, safe. You have exceptions like Frenchtown. You have Gallows Bay, which was more impacted than Christiansted in St. Croix. You have Smith Bay. You have Cruz Bay. You have Coral Bay. Those are all down low, and people do sleep in houses down near the shore. But for the most part, most of us are sleeping well above the tsunami evacuation contour. And of course, in terms of what's available to be damaged, well, the ships of 1867, the British Empire, others, the La Plata, they would carry hundreds of people. Specifically, the Rhone would carry more than up to 200 people. But today, cruise ships that might be in St. Thomas or St. John or St. Croix harbors might have as many. The maximum we've spoken about recently is the Harmony of the Seas, which had up to 7,800 people, including crew. So whereas the fatalities in 1867 could be less than 30, it seems almost impossible for a local tsunami happening today to do anything but take many more than 30 lives. And with that, I thank you. A word about paying attention to your surroundings. You should know your local hazards. There are ways in which you can protect yourself by knowing the warning signs, the natural warning signs. That is, the earthquake itself is a warning sign. The unusual behavior of the sea, whether it's going out, coming in strongly, or just acting agitated. Tsunamis, when they're coming upon you, always make a lot of noise. So there's rumbling and roaring noises from the sea. You're supposed to drop, cover, and hold during the earthquake. And then, if it really was a significant earthquake, and if you're near the coast, move quickly away from the shorelines. Get to high ground. Don't do as this poor person doing. What he has done with his earphones is he's not associating with his natural environment. Okay, he's not open to the natural warning signs. I thank you very much. Befallende Ehre gut.